Characters of the Reformation, Part 6. Mary Stuart. The first thing to appreciate about Mary Stuart is that she was the legitimate Queen of England after the death of Mary Tudor. Each of the other very important points in connection with her fascination, her individual character, her follies, her courage, her later heroism, and what may almost be called her martyrdom, all the particular historical problems connected with her career, such as the authenticity of the casket letters, or her real attitude towards the so-called Babington plot, have their rightful place. But we must beware of putting them in the wrong order. Protestant history, and, therefore, our official history, such as it is taught in the English universities and have spread throughout English literature in textbooks and fiction, gave a thoroughly wrong perspective of this, as of every other essential matter in the English Reformation. One would gather from this official version and its effects and its general literature that Mary was a sort of untoward accident, interfering with the normal process of English political life in the late 16th century. Her presence and her claims are represented as being dreaded by the England of her day, as might be dreaded by the presence of an alien body in an organism, which alien body that organism must get rid of if it is to survive. The truth is just the other way. Mary was regarded by the general opinion of the time as the woman who ought by right to be the Queen of England. She was certainly legitimate, while Elizabeth, her rival, was certainly illegitimate by all the moral canons of the day. She stood in her later years not only for the Catholic religion, to which the mass of Englishmen still adhered in general sympathy at least, but also for the principle then held as something of awful sanctity, the principle of the royal blood, the right of men and women to rule by descent and primogeniture. It is essential in history to read every period according to the spirit of that period, even when that spirit has disappeared or has been so modified that we moderns have difficulty in understanding its strength. In most discussions of Queen Elizabeth's reign, which was really the reign of the Cecils, that essential point is overlooked. But, indeed, the fault is the commonest one in all dealings with the past. It is the same fault which makes people ridicule, instead of trying to understand, the violence of the theological controversy in the Eastern Empire, or the sentiment of loyalty and service which was the cement of the feudal system. In the same way, some historian of the future might misunderstand the whole of the 19th century by ridiculing as absurd and incomprehensible the sentiment of nationalism or the ideals of democracy. Mary Stuart was, in the eyes of her contemporaries, the legitimate Queen of England for the following reason. She was the senior legitimate descendant of an English king, to wit, Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII. Henry VII had 3 children who survived to have children themselves. These 3 children of Henry VII were Henry, who became Henry VIII, Margaret, who became Queen of Scotland, and Mary, who became Queen of France, and afterwards Duchess of Suffolk. Henry VIII had 2 legitimate children who survived him, Mary Tudor and little Edward. Edward came first because he was a male. Mary Tudor was next in succession according to all the ideals and morals of the time. Henry VIII also had two illegitimate children. One, the Duke of Richmond, died young. The other, Elizabeth, survived. She was illegitimate in the eyes of Christendom, generally, according to all the ideas of the time, because she was born while the legitimate wife of Henry was still alive. The marriage not having been declared null by competent authority, but only at the orders of Henry himself. Therefore, when Mary Tudor was dead, one had to look to the descendants of Henry VII's two daughters to find senior representative of the royal blood. It is true that Henry VIII had made a will in which he named his successors after his own children, wherein he included Elizabeth. These successors whom he named were the descendants of Mary, Duchess of Suffolk, his younger sister. And he said nothing about the descendants of Margaret, his elder one. It is also true that this will was given the force of a statute by the king in Parliament. But it is false to regard the crown of England as dependent upon a parliamentary title. That theory was invented long after. Nor could a king legally name his successor at his own caprice, though it is true that the desires of a monarch in this matter did weigh heavily at the time. What counted most with all men was the sanctity of the blood royal and the rights of seniority. Since Margaret, Queen of Scotland, was the elder daughter of Henry VII, her descendants had the prior claim. The descendants of Mary, Duchess of Suffolk, were the Ladies Grey, and it will be remembered that the elder of them, Lady Jane Grey, was made a claimant for the throne on that account, because though she was of the junior branch, she was Protestant. Of the elder sister Margaret, the first descendant was her son, the King of Scotland, but he was dead, and the second was that son's only child, Mary Stuart. Mary Stuart was therefore, by all the ideas of the time, the person who had a right to be Queen of England when Mary Tudor died. On that the whole of her story turns. People felt about it just as today they feel about an election. A man who has received a majority of votes in an electoral college to be President of the United States, or to be a member of Parliament for an English constituency, we regard as the illegitimate holder of that office, and anyone who should try to hold it in opposition to him with a minority of votes, we should regard as having no legitimate right, however much we might approve of him in other ways. In the 16th century, all the morals of the time took it for granted that the ruler of a monarchic country should be the senior representative of the blood royal. Now, as against the indefensible claim of Mary Stuart's, there went the following points in practice. First, she was not English. She was born to the throne of Scotland. She had been brought up in France. She was an alien, for Scotland in those days was regarded as alien to England, and even as one of the chief enemies of England. Again, because Scotland always allied herself with France in order to preserve her independence against her neighbor England, Mary Stuart had been married to the heir of the French king, and during the brief reign of that heir, who died a few months after his succession, she was actually Queen of France. At the moment when Mary Tudor died, she was living in France as the wife of this young heir. To have made her Queen of England then would have meant the probable amalgamation in the near future of Scotland, England, and France under one crown. That would have been a loss of national independence for England. Also, there could have been no question of the French court releasing her and bringing her over to England, though she was made, of course, to affirm her rightful claim at once. Further, it was all important to Philip, the King of Spain, of whom the French were the dangerous rivals and enemies, to prevent French influence from growing in England. Therefore, he strongly supported Elizabeth, who was on the spot, and whom Cecil, with Philip behind him, put upon the throne. When Mary Stuart's young husband, the King of France, died, she was only in her 18th year. She was only henceforward Queen Dowager of France, and there could be no question of an amalgamation of the two thrones. Still, she was French-bred and represented French influence, and her mother of the great French house of Guise had been the regent in Scotland, so she was still a thoroughly foreign claimant in English eyes, though the legitimate claimant. And that feeling was emphasized when she went back to Scotland as queen the next year, landing some months before her 19th birthday. So strong was the feeling that her claim might succeed, that Cecil was all for getting hold of her and keeping her prisoner, and that an attempt was made to seize her as she sailed past the eastern coasts of England on her way north. The attempt failed through a fog, but luck would have it that Cecil had his way in the long run after all, and Mary became his captive. The way this happened was as follows. When Mary landed in Scotland, the religious revolution which, as we have seen, had made some little progress in England, though not much, which in Germany had swept everything into violent turmoil, and which in France was soon to bring about prolonged civil war, had in Scotland achieved a very great measure of success. Calvinism had become the enthusiastic creed of a minority, burning with zeal and determined to succeed. The majority were not similarly zealous for the defense of the Church, which in Scotland had become thoroughly corrupt, and the great Scottish nobles who had everything in their hands supported the religious revolution because it gave them the power to loot the Church and the monarchy wholesale. Into this anarchy Mary was plunged. For 7 years her invincible courage still maintained her as queen, but her temperament ruined what small chances she had of maintaining her position. We must remember in her favor that she was a woman of especial fascination, which in a sense she exercises to this day. And that, yet, it was her misfortune to be married first to a sickly boy even younger than herself, who died before she was 18, and next by her own judgment and error to her cousin Darnley, a debauched and worthless character. She was accused, falsely, of having taken part in the murder of Darnley. The act was really that of the rebel Scotch nobles, but it was widely believed that she was guilty of it, and still more widely believed, it is still a problem, that she was at any rate cognizant of what was in the wind. It was her temperament again that made her fall a victim to Bothwell, one of her own great nobles in Scotland, a masterly man to whom she succumbed. Though she was the representative of Catholicism, she married him with Calvinistic rites, and as he was universally regarded as at least one of the murderers of her first husband, the scandal was enormous. She was imprisoned, she escaped, she was defeated, and in 1568, her 26th year, she escaped, unarmed and without resources, over the border into England, trusting to the promised protection of Elizabeth. From that moment, of course, she was in Cecil's power. She was held first virtually, than actually as a prisoner, and so remained for nearly 20 years. Now during all those 20 years, Mary Stuart's position, in the eyes of Europe, and in the eyes of many Englishmen, was that of the legitimate Queen of England, imprisoned by the government of a usurper. With that attitude, the bulk of Englishmen did not agree. They were used to the Tudor dynasty. They had been familiar throughout her life with Elizabeth, who was now upon the throne and had been for now 10 years the figurehead, at least, of government, and a vigorous figurehead, though really ruled by Cecil. Yet there was a large minority of Englishmen who felt so strongly in this matter that they would have put Mary Stuart upon the throne, or at any rate have insisted upon her succeeding Elizabeth, for it was getting more and more certain that Elizabeth was incapable of having an heir. There was a rebellion in Mary's favor, which was crushed by Cecil's government with utmost barbarity, and thenceforward her immediate cause was lost. An effort to marry her to the young Duke of Norfolk, who, though a strong Protestant, represented the older nobility, was discovered by Cecil and was used by him as a pretext for putting Norfolk to death and for affirming his triumph over his rivals. And thenceforward Mary remained not only a closer prisoner than ever, but one whom Cecil also planned to put to death in her turn. Cecil's main reason for getting Mary out of the way was the fact that he was the head of the clique of new millionaires, who could not be certain of their continued power unless Catholicism was crushed. And a second reason was that, through the growing Protestantism of Scotland, Cecil and the English government could become the protectors of Scotland, which kingdom this policy in the long run wholly subjected to English influence, until at last, long after Cecil's death, the two countries were merged into one, and Scotland, though Scotsmen to this day will never admit it, became but a province of English rule. For a long time, as everybody knows, Scotland and England, united by their common Protestantism and by 1,000 consequent ties, have become one nation. Now, to put Mary Stuart to death was an enormity, yet the demand for it was present and open, and Cecil worked for it with all his might against every moral obstacle, and finally succeeded. A pretext had to be found. It was found in the following manner. Cecil's man Walsingham, his head spy and extremely efficient at his trade, sent an agent provocateur, what is called, in modern English slang, a narc, to stir up one more of the innumerable plots against Elizabeth abroad. This agent, a renegade Catholic of the name of Gifford, egged on a group of hot-headed people, refugee Catholics in France, with a rich and romantic young man called Babington as their nominal head, to plot the release of Mary Stuart from captivity, to put her on the throne of England, and, at least, to constrain, and, if necessary, to kill Elizabeth. To devise rebellion against the reigning sovereign, and especially to envisage her death, was high treason. And the essential of Walsingham's action was to make out a case that Mary Stuart was partly to the plot, and, particularly, to the death of Elizabeth. In order to make out this case, a system was devised whereby letters passing from the conspirators to Mary Stuart and from her to all in the outside world could be read without her knowledge. A go-between was suborned, who was supposed to be a faithful adherent of Mary's, but was really a traitor in the pay of Walsingham and his officials. In one of these letters, sent by Babington, allusion was made to the killing of Elizabeth. Mary replied to it. Did she in that reply take part in the project for the killing of the reigning English queen? Walsingham said she did, but the draft of her letter, which remained in Walsingham's possession, he never dared produce. It came out that, at least, one very important sentence in this letter had been deliberately forged by Phillips, one of Walsingham's officials, with Walsingham's knowledge, and was not written by Mary after all. It is the sentence in which she was made to ask for a list of the names of the men who were to do the deed. It is the sentence in which she was made to ask for a list of the names of the men who were to do the deed. It is therefore presumable that Walsingham's accusation was false, and that Mary never consented to the death of her cousin. She herself always vehemently denied it. She repeatedly challenged her prosecutors to produce the original drafts of the letters, which they refused to do. On their unsupported word, she was condemned to death. But Elizabeth appreciated what her responsibility would be in the eyes of all Europe, and what an abominable thing it was to bring an anointed sovereign and her own cousin and legitimate heir, for that matter the true Queen of England, to the scaffold. But Cecil was too powerful for Elizabeth. He was her master. The warrant had been signed, but Elizabeth had not given her assent to its being acted upon. Cecil took that responsibility upon himself, and, without Elizabeth's permission, had Mary Stuart beheaded on February 8th, 1587. The outrage raised a prodigious storm throughout Christendom. Philip of Spain launched the Armada against England to avenge it, and the Armada failed. All this group of events, ending in the failure of the Armada, made up the decisive and final crisis and success of the English Reformation. Thenceforward Cecil's increasingly successful plan was secure, and there could be no going back. Very much more follows upon the tremendous business of Mary's violent death at the hands of the English government, the most important of which was perhaps the precedent which it gave against all the morals and ideas of the time for the trial of a sovereign by subjects, a precedent with a tragic result for her grandson, Charles I. There runs, then, through the whole of Mary Stuart's story a group of intertwining threads, which we may tabulate as follows. First, she was representative of legitimacy, and her tragedy put an end to the hitherto unchallenged claims in morals of the blood royal to rule. Next, she was the symbol of Catholicism in Great Britain, and her tragedy marked the defeat of Catholicism. Thirdly, that tragedy meant the gradual absorption of Scotland as a nation under the influence of England. Mary Stuart's son, James, whom she had not seen since he was a baby, was brought up a Calvinist through Cecil's influence and kept in the pay of Cecil's government. He shamefully acquiesced in his mother's death, and had his reward by being introduced to the English throne on the death of Elizabeth by Cecil's son, Robert. He reigned as James I of England and James VI of Scotland, uniting the two nations under one head. The whole story of this unfortunate woman remains, and will remain, full of unsolved problems. Mary Stuart will always be for some a martyr, for others a criminal, so long as the religious passions which center round her name survive. The authenticity of the casket letters, to which I have alluded and which were supposed to prove her complicity with Bothwell in the murder of Darnley, are still debated and perhaps will always be debated, and it is not the least tragic element in this tragedy that a complete and certain historical account of it still remains impossible. William Cecil. William Cecil, who is better known as Lord Burleigh, the title he took after clinching his great success in the middle of his career, was the author of Protestant England. One might call him the creator of modern England as a whole, for he stands at the root of the Church of England, the typical central religious institution following on the English Reformation, and it was under his rule that the seeds were sown of all that later developed into what is now the English political and social system. It has often been remarked that England, more than any other European country, is cut off from her past. When England became Protestant, she became a new thing, and the old Catholic England of the 1,000 years before the Reformation is, to the Englishman after the Reformation, a foreign country. Now the true artisan of that prodigious change was William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. Thomas Cromwell was the man who achieved the breach with Rome and who launched England out onto the beginnings of the adventure, but William Cecil was the man who, by his own genius and that of his son Robert, did the essential work of changing England from a Catholic to a Protestant country. It was he who eradicated the faith from the English mind. It was he who prevented the succor of Catholic England by the power of Catholic Europe outside. It was he who instituted and maintained a reign of terror, the long endurance of which at last crushed out the mass from English soil. The false official history, which has been taught so long, ascribes what was really the action of Burleigh to Queen Elizabeth. A false legend has been created with the object of exalting the character of that unhappy and distorted woman, but in truth she was but a figurehead, and it was William Cecil who, during her reign, molded events to his will. His was a very great political genius. The genius was sent in a despicable character, mean, sly, avaricious, and thoroughly false. Morally he was a shriveled soul corresponding to his little wizened body and face, but intellectually he was of the highest stature. To that unique intelligence of his was added an untiring industry and prodigious memory which between them left him in the period of his rise in power without a rival. For he was in the midst of men bent upon the loot of the church, upon pleasure, upon intriguing for places at court, for salaries, and for fragment after fragment of the royal fortune which they were dilapidating. None of them did any work, unless it can be called work, to pursue such ends. William Cecil worked all his life with an iron will and a grasp of detail unparalleled in his time, and hardly equaled before or since. He had also an invincible tenacity, pursuing an original plan unswervingly and molding to it any passing event. He had a profound knowledge of men, choosing his servants with skill and playing upon the weaknesses of all around him. He acted admirably. He could nearly always take a victim in, and the old fox, as they nicknamed him, towards the end of his career, won nearly every conflict in which he was engaged. He was without joy, and one may fairly say without religion. His motive was not hatred of the Catholic Church, such as we find in Cranmer, or in his own servant and head spy, Walsingham, the chief of his intelligence department. He destroyed the Church of England because he desired to confirm his own wealth and that of the clique upon which he was the head, the new millionaires who had risen upon the booty of the monasteries, the bishoprics, and all the rest. He himself was not, oddly enough, a direct thief of church land. The huge fortune of the Cecils, which has kept them an important family even to this day, came from the betrayal of colleagues, the enjoyment of lucrative posts, and all that can be done by unscrupulous men in power to their own enrichment. The lands they held were largely church lands, but at second hand. The Cecils had no considerable grant that I can remember out of the original loot. Yet were they, and Cecil, their founder, the typical and representative heads of all that new wealth which arose on the ruins of religion in England. William Cecil was, like Gardiner, of middle-class rank by birth. His father was what we should call today a permanent official in the government service. That is, he held a post in the establishment of Henry VIII. William's grandfather, the father of the official, had kept a hotel in Stamford, which is a town standing on the great Roman road running north from London. It is about 90 miles from the capital. Close to Stamford town, on the hill to the south of it, was the convent of Burghley, out of the ruins of which was later erected the magnificent palace which the family still holds, and from which William Cecil took his title. Henry VIII's official put the lad to Cambridge when he was 15 years of age, just after Thomas Cromwell had broken with the papacy. He did not rise very rapidly. He was nearly 30 before the father of his second wife introduced him to the Protector Somerset, the uncle of Edward VI, and the man who attempted to impose Calvinism upon England during that little prince's brief reign. He became Somerset's secretary, knowing all his secrets and keeping all his papers. Then came his chance. After he had been secretary to Somerset for less than 2 years, another member of the gang who were running the unfortunate little child king, to wit Dudley, plotted to make himself supreme and to oust Somerset. Somerset, in his peril, turned to his secretary, and was aghast to find that he had been betrayed. The details of the betrayal we do not know, but we do know that William Cecil suddenly jumped from a good moderate position of what we should call today, perhaps £800 a year, to very great wealth. And, what is more, his patron, to whom he had betrayed his old master, made him secretary to the council, that is, made him the man who kept all the state papers and knew all the state secrets. In that position, his wealth, of course, continued to increase. Although he had conspired against Mary with the rest of the council, he managed to save himself. He outwardly conformed to the national religion during the Catholic Queen's reign, and he used to make a parade of carrying an enormous pair of rosary beads to emphasize his zeal. Then, when Mary died in 1558, it was he who got Elizabeth on the throne, and she remained for the next 20 years wholly dependent upon his vast political capacity. It was he who suggested the gradual plan for ousting the Catholic hierarchy, and who saw to it that a secret committee should frame the new religion, at the head of which he put as archbishop an old Cambridge friend, companion, and dependent of his, Parker. His subtlety in gradually derailing England from her Catholic course was amazing. He found in these first years of his power a country the whole bulk of which was still entirely Catholic, in practice, daily habit, and tradition. He could not challenge directly a force of that kind, but he undermined it. He played the card of national feeling. He relied upon Philip of Spain, the chief Catholic champion, to plead with the Pope that the new English Church was, after all, tolerable and that the schism might not be permanent. Meanwhile, he prevented any direct action on the part of the Pope in England, and he prevented a nuncio from landing. Though the first laws had been passed making the worship in all the parish churches that of the new Anglican establishment, yet the authorities winked at a large amount of toleration, going slowly in order to do their work more thoroughly later on. Men would take communion in the Anglican form, and later take it in the Catholic form from the hands of the same parish priest, and Cecil boasted that no man suffered on account of his religion, only for treason to the state. Throughout his life he continued to play that card of national feeling as the strongest he had in his game against Rome. Meanwhile, though openly the ally of Spain, and even dependent upon Spain for maintaining Elizabeth's insecure position, he was working underground to produce the ultimate rupture with Spain, and his genius was never better shown than when, on the pretext of protecting them from piracy, and also of examining into the credentials of the bullion they had on board, he detained in English ports the Spanish ship, which had taken refuge there from pirates, while on the way to carry the pay to the Spanish king's soldiers in the revolted Netherlands. Cecil had calculated that Spain dared not fight since she needed England, small and weak though England then was, as an ally against France. It was taking a big risk, for if Philip had then declared war, Cecil's game would have been ruined. But Spain did not declare war, and friendship was openly maintained between the two crowns, though from that moment Philip of Spain knew that Cecil was working against him. The Spanish effort in the Netherlands was hamstrung by this cutting off of supplies. And, meanwhile, the principal leaders of the old Catholic nobility in England were goaded into rebellion. They rose in the 10th year of Cecil's power, and that was Cecil's opportunity which he had himself created. The Catholic rebellion was put down with ghastly ferocity, drowned in blood, and Cecil could henceforward make use of the plea that attachment to the universal religion of Christendom was treason in any subject of Elizabeth's. The plots for the re-establishment of Catholicism, and therefore for the destruction of Elizabeth, Cecil watched, discovered, and nourished, under his extraordinarily efficient spy system, at the head of which was, as we have seen, his man Walsingham. The most famous example of his ability in this line was his catching of John Hawkins, the pirate and slave dealer, the man who was the teacher of Drake, and, with Drake, the best seaman of his time. Cecil found Hawkins negotiating secretly with the King of Spain. Having so discovered him, Hawkins' life was in Cecil's hands, and Cecil compelled him to act as an agent and to continue to pretend to be Philip's friend, and to continue his correspondence with Spain. In this way, Cecil discovered all that Philip was doing. Next, he patronized Drake, always disavowing the piracies and murders of that buccaneer, apologizing to Spain for the outrages, and even sometimes giving restitution, but all the while supporting Drake underhand, and allowing him a small percentage of his loot by way of pay. He sheltered Drake from the most obvious consequences of his crimes, particularly in the case of the odious murder of Doughty, for we know now, though it was long hidden, that it was Cecil who prevented the prosecution of Drake by the Doughty family when they clamored for justice. Meanwhile, of course, open persecution of the Catholic faith in England could, on the pretext of the recent rebellion, be launched. The old nobility, at the head of which was the Duke of Norfolk, were humbled, and the young Duke himself, though an ardent Protestant, was lured into a position where Cecil, feigning the deepest friendship for him, would bring him to the scaffold, which he did. From that moment in 1572, Cecil was supreme. He was at the height of his great powers, a man just over 50, and completely dominating the sickly and chafing queen, in whose name he acted. The persecution grew more intense, until it was what I have called it, a reign of terror. But all the time Cecil, working hard upon the natural patriotism of England and insisting that he was only persevering the integrity and independence of the realm, maintained that the shocking executions and universal system of suppression and secret police work were not religious in motive, but only political. He kept to his formula that no man suffered for religion, but only for treason. He exactly judged the moment when the weakness of France, through the religious war which had broken out in that country, would permit him to defy Spain, and to emphasize the now thoroughly Protestant character of the English government. By the prevention of any educational facilities on the Catholic side, by putting of all offices, academic or of magistry, or of the executive, into the hands of his creatures, he began breeding up a whole generation of young Englishmen in whom a strong minority, gradually turning into a majority, were opposed to the faith. Yet throughout the business he kept the average Englishman bewildered as to whether it were really a fight between Catholicism and its enemies, or only between England and her political opponents. When he had already grown old, and had begun to introduce his second son Robert, whom he had carefully trained in statecraft, and who was his father's equal in brains and energy, to the conduct of public affairs, and came to the test of the Armada. Had the Armada succeeded, there would have been, of course, a great Catholic rising, which could not have failed to be successful. Elizabeth would without doubt have yielded to her natural inclination and followed the Catholic desires of her people. Cecil would have fled if he had been able, or if he had not been able he would have been killed. But the Armada failed, and with its failure Cecil's great experiment took root and was founded for good. He was then a man of nearly 70. Not long afterwards he died. That second son of his, as astute as his father, was a dwarf and hunchback with an enormous head, inheriting from his father and continuing the excellent spy system which was the basis of their power. He completed the work. This Robert Cecil, who was later made Lord Salisbury, lived to see the tide turned. He may not have actually launched, but he certainly knew all about and nursed the gunpowder plot, and his triumph on that occasion settled the collapse of the faith in England. Henceforward those in sympathy with Catholicism in varying degrees, and ardent Catholics were already a minority, were divided amongst themselves. It was the better part of a lifetime since the Mass had been forbidden in England. The heroic efforts of the Jesuits to create a reaction had failed, and though in mere numbers those who opposed the Catholic Church were not a large majority, they gave the tone to the whole. England between 1605 and 1612, when Robert Cecil died, already stood before the world as a Protestant power, the only considerable Protestant power in Europe, and all this was but the completion of William Cecil's work. He, more than any other man, had made it possible for the Dutch provinces in the Netherlands to throw over their legitimate Spanish king, and, though a very large minority of the Dutch were still Catholic, the new power of Holland stood side by side with England as a Protestant center. This was the great work which William Cecil had set out to do in England and Europe accomplished. On this account the whole of that decisive period in English history should properly be called the Reign of the Cecils. It was they who introduced James I, just as they had introduced Elizabeth, to the throne. It was they who guided and shepherded the nation into new paths. Such was William Cecil, one of the greatest and certainly one of the vilest of men that ever lived. His work has outlived him and his associates by many hundreds years. Henry IV of France. With the opening of the 17th century, the Reformation enters its second phase. It first had been a universal struggle to determine whether the faith should be retained by all Europe or lost by all Europe. The struggle had been accompanied by Spain by violent repressions, in the Germanies by local conflicts, compromises and conferences, in France by violent civil war. In England the faith had been worsted by the consistent pressure against it of government, and with the loss of England, and Scotland under English power, the chance of a complete victory for Catholicism was lost. It was lost by 1606. Henceforward we have in all Europe a second phase, more political and less religious than the first, a division of Europe into two parts, Catholic and Protestant, which gradually crystallized and became permanent. France fell after its exhausting civil war onto the Catholic side, but not thoroughly. The weakened combatants had ended by a compromise. Henry IV of France was the typical figure of the compromise. He was symbolic of the way in which the great religious struggle of the 17th century in Europe was going to end. It had long looked as though, one, it would end either by the complete dislocation of Catholicism and its replacement by a mass of Protestant sects, the enthusiasm of which would soon die away and leave civilization in ruins, or as though, two, the Catholic reaction would set in and would save the situation completely, as though the states and cities, which had rebelled against religious unity and looted church wealth, were going to be reconquered by Catholicism, partly through missionary work, but more through the victory of the Catholic princes and the populations in the religious wars. But in point of fact, neither of these solutions took place. The great struggle ended without a decision. Towards the middle of the 17th century, round about 1650, the two cultures, now firmly established in its own region, were left each facing the other. The Catholic culture failed to re-establish itself completely throughout Christendom. The Protestant culture did not spread itself, as it had hoped, throughout all Christendom. The first symptom of what was going to happen took place in France, at the beginning of this last phase, that is, a little before the year 1600, after the religious wars. The struggle between the old religion and its enemies had been going on for a whole lifetime in fierce fighting, civil wars, popular revolts, etc., connected with the quarrel, had extended over 50 years. The active government of the French people had lain for many centuries in the hands of a royal family called the Capetian House, from their father Hugh Capet, who was the first king of that dynasty in France. The French monarchy had a strict rule of succession, whereby the next male heir must take the throne upon the death of the last king. The French crown could not be inherited by a woman, even through a woman. For some hundreds of years it had gone from father to son without a break. Then the last king had no surviving son, only a daughter, and the same was true of his brother who succeeded, so that the next male heir was only a cousin. Though this cousin was of the Capetian house, he had a special title of his own, Valois, and the kings descended from this cousin were called the House of Valois. Now, just when the Reformation quarrel was at its height, just as the moment when Queen Mary was trying to restore Catholicism for good in England, and the Emperor in Germany was doing all he could to keep the peace between two sides, it became clear that the Valois line was going to fail also. There was a succession of 3 sickly young men, none of whom had heirs, or probably could have had their heirs. The nearest male heir was a distant cousin, and to find a common ancestor between him and the reigning king, one had to go back nearly 300 years. This distant cousin belonged to a junior branch of the Capetian house, which had the title of Bourbon. But their lands in the center of France. Anthony de Bourbon, the head of the family, at the time when the sickly Valois boys were successively occupying the French throne, happened also to be king of a little Basque district on the extreme boundaries of France, just beyond the southern frontier called Navarre. Being the next heir, he declared in favor of the Protestant cause, and his young son, Henry, who was a fine soldierly young man, very different from his sickly Valois cousins, was brought up to be a Protestant. Something like half the nobility of France had also joined the religious revolt, hoping like their fellows and contemporaries, the English squires, to make a good thing out of it by looting the church land, as that had been done in England, Scotland, northern Germany, and Switzerland. They, therefore, began attacks upon the regular government of the Valois kings, who stood for the old orthodoxy. These attacks, from skirmishes and plots against individual lives, developed into a regular civil war, called in the history of France the Wars of Religion. The French Protestant rebels were called Huguenots, and their heir presumptive to the throne, Anthony de Bourbon, King of Navarre, was the head of the faction. The most powerful man, however, among the Huguenots was one of the 3 wealthy Coligny brothers, known as the Admiral, because he was Admiral of France, that is, supervising naval business and drawing his revenue from wreckage, prize money, etc., while his opponent, the most powerful man of the Catholic side, was the Duc de Guise of the House of Lorraine. The Coligny faction had murdered a Guise, and the Guise, therefore, watched to destroy the power of Coligny and his Huguenot followers. The crown, which was really run not by the succession of sickly boys, but by their mother, Catherine de' Medici, a woman of great energy and intelligence, was determined to be subject neither to the one faction nor the other, and the most dangerous one at the moment was that of the Huguenots under Coligny. They were sufficiently successful in their rebellious war that they might come to command the whole country, change its religion, and, of course, loot all the church wealth and become, as the English squires became in their turn, more powerful than the crown itself. It happened that a great number of Huguenots had come up to Paris to assist at the wedding of young Henry Bourbon, the son of the King of Navarre, to the sister of the reigning king, who was Catherine de' Medici's daughter. Coligny, plotting actively, was in Paris also threatening the crown. The Queen Mother determined, therefore, to have him assassinated. The populace of Paris, already intensely exasperated against the Huguenots, who were chiefly powerful in the south of France, seized the opportunity, and this first attack on Coligny was the signal for a general rising of the whole people of Paris on a scale which no one had expected. The people chased the Huguenot gentlemen out of their houses and murdered them in the street, where there was a massacre of them and their servants. In great public disturbances of this sort, many, of course, fall who are little connected with the real issue. Debtors take the opportunity of getting rid of their creditors, and jealous men of their rivals. It is not known how many were killed altogether, but the probable number of victims in Paris was 2,000, and there were risings in many other towns as well. This violent outburst of popular feeling against the gentry who were fomenting civil war is known as the Massacre of St. Bartholomew, because it began on the vigil of St. Bartholomew's Day and continued on the day itself, August 22nd to 23rd, 1572. It is probable that this date for attacking the Huguenots was chosen and did not come haphazard. The Huguenots had been guilty of a particularly treacherous murder of Catholics on the same day, St. Bartholomew's Day, 3 years before, and it is said that the royal family had sworn to have their revenge. Anyhow, it is generally known in history as the St. Bartholomew. The young Henry of Bourbon saved his life with difficulty. The massacre had a double effect. It exasperated the religious wars, of course, adding a powerful motive of vengeance to the original motive of religious difference, which was mainly avarice on the part of the Huguenot nobility, but it also had the effect of frightening the Huguenot faction, who had not guessed how violent the popular anger against them was. It showed that the temper of Paris, which counted for so much in those days in French affairs, was now definitely turned against the Reformation, and that the capital would have none of it, regarding those who supported it as traitors and rebels and public thieves. The religious wars went on with great violence. old Anthony de Bourbon, the King of Navarre, died, and his son Henry succeeded him, but continued to lead the Huguenot forces in the Civil War. The last of the Valois brothers was now king, under the title of Henry III. His health was bad, and he could certainly have no children, and he recognized Henry of Bourbon as the new king of Navarre, who was his cousin, as his heir. But Paris was so angry with the Protestant faction, and so for that matter was the greater part of the country, that it refused to accept Henry of Navarre as its future king. It even preferred to break with the immemorial tradition of having the male head of the Capetian house for the monarch, and prepared to put a younger heir upon the throne. The principle of strict hereditary monarchy in the male line was so strong in France at the time that this seemed a desperate resolve. The king, Henry III, left his capital and took refuge with his cousin, Henry of Navarre, and together they besieged Paris from outside. A private man who was particularly excited against the Huguenot faction asked for an interview with the king, was granted it, and used the opportunity to stab Henry III to death. With the death of the last Valois, Henry of Navarre was legitimate king of France. He had the powerful Huguenot army at his service, and, because he had hereditary right on his side, though still a Protestant, numbers of the Catholic gentry joined him as well. The action of Paris in preferring religion to hereditary right was odious to them. But Paris held out and formed the center of resistance to the Bourbon. Up to this point it had seemed probable that Henry of Navarre would make good his right to the succession, and that France would have a Protestant king. If that should take place, all the Protestant leaders, who were quite half the nobility of the country, would have received a great accession of power. A general loot of church lands would certainly have begun after the platform of what had happened in England, and probably the faith would ultimately have been lost to France. Had France gone Protestant, the center of gravity in Europe, from being with the Catholic culture, would have passed to the Protestant culture. What saved the situation was the continued tenacity of the people of Paris. Although Henry of Navarre was still victorious, they were determined not to give way, and though they were subjected to a most horrible famine, they refused to yield. At last it was Henry of Navarre himself who gave way. He may or may not have used the famous words, "Paris is worth the Mass," but these words certainly expressed his sentiments. He himself, like most of his rank in those days, had no real religion. The Huguenot preachers, whom he had to listen to, bored him intensely. He was a very loose liver, much attracted to his pleasures, the very opposite of a Puritan. He had the virtues of a soldier with no real faith in any doctrine. He judged that it would be better, after all, to accept the religion of the bulk of his subjects as, unless he did so, he might never be allowed to reign in peace. This decision of Henry of Navarre to become Catholic was, as I have said, the first act of the great compromise by which Europe ultimately settled down into two opposing cultures, Catholic and Protestant. It marked the victory of popular Catholicism in France and the end of the chances, which once had stood so high, of Protestantism capturing that country. But the thing was not a Catholic victory by any means. It was what I have called it, a compromise. Henry's old comrade in arms retained their violent opposition to Catholicism. His right-hand man, Sully, who worked his finances and was even more avaricious than most of the Huguenot set, was an example in point. And on all sides the Huguenots retained their great power. The new king further favored them, with the object of retaining their support and reigning peaceably, by issuing an edict known to history as the Edict of Nantes. Under this arrangement a very large measure of toleration, and something a good deal more than toleration, was granted to the Huguenots. They were to be allowed to hold a certain number of strong towns, and to garrison them, and govern them independently, and thus form a sort of kingdom within the kingdom. So, while in England Catholics were persecuted to the death, though still some half of the population, in France the Protestants, though but a small minority outside the noble class, were given all these advantages. They could practice their religion, of course, but, what was much more important politically, they could and did hold these strong places independently, whence they could make war against the crown and threaten the mass of their fellow citizens. They had, in particular, among the strong towns, that of La Rochelle, an important seaport on the Bay of Biscay, which was as though in England at that time, it was towards the end of the reign of Elizabeth, the Catholics had been allowed to hold Portsmouth and, say, Chester, York, Leicester, and a number of other walled towns in the kingdom. So stood the compromise when Henry IV, in his turn, was stabbed by another half-witted and fanatical defender of the Catholic cause who, quite rightly, doubted the king's sincerity. Henry IV, the first Bourbon king, died thus in the year 1610. France was not, at his death, a fully Catholic country. On the contrary, it had to become, through his action, a country in which a powerful anti-Catholic faction, counting many of the richest families in the kingdom, was tolerated and held important strongholds, as well as having the right to combine and put up effective resistance to the mass of the nation. The ultimate result of thus establishing a dualism of religion was a current of French opinion which in the course of 2 more generations began to shift from Protestantism to a skeptical form of anti-Catholicism. But still, take it for all in all, the Catholic culture of France had been saved by Henry of Bourbon's abjuration. And that king, known to history as Henry Quatre, had, though not intending to do so, saved the civilization of the country and of Europe, though hardly. While this was going on in France, Henry's contemporary in England, James I, was giving an example of a different kind. He was establishing the Protestant doctrine of the divine right of kings, which has become, in course time, the modern doctrine of the supremacy of the state over the church and the civil power over religious power. How James I represented this, I will explain in the next chapter.